Hello and welcome to Naked Genetics, the show which seeks to find out just what is going on in your genes. I'm Will Tingle, and join me as we seek to cover the latest in genetics research and see just what the front line of genetic mapping and sequencing can reveal about our world. This episode: has the evolutionary advantage to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder been uncovered? We'll find out. We also look at the microbiome of mining and the only vertebrate in the world that would thank you for saying that it looked like crap. First up this week, let's look at a big story in the genetic sphere and ask what might be some of the deeper questions being asked by geneticists. This week's news story centres around attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder which typically presents with inattention, impulsive behaviour and hyperactivity. For those that have been diagnosed, or have been waiting a long time, purely hypothetically, the treatment would imply that ADHD is something of a detriment in this day and age. But this study, published in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B Biological Sciences, has a theory that not too long ago, such a genetic mutation may have been somewhat beneficial. Let's link back up with our genetics experts, Shivani Shukla and Erwin Scally. To start us off then, Shivani, would you mind talking us through what has to be one of the most out there methodologies that I've ever seen in really any study to do with genetics? What was going on and why were people foraging for berries?
So yes, it's definitely different to sampling skeletons. So this time they had an interactive video game online and they had a couple hundred of people essentially scavenge for berries on bushes, and it was under time pressure, so they could either stay at the same bush looking for berries, or they could move on to another bush which used up time, but they may or may not find even more berries. So it was a trade-off between time spent and number of berries collected. And then they took the scores of these couple of hundred people and also then screened all of them for symptoms of ADHD, which currently in the UK we diagnose with the DSM-5 criteria. And it was found that people who displayed traits of ADHD actually scored higher and spent more time moving on to new pastures to look for berries, essentially.
So all these years when I've been told I get distracted too easily, that I could just have been retorting with, yes, but I'm going to find the next patch of good-looking berries sooner than a potential rival.
And more generally, it's an example of the kind of thing that we see quite a lot in evolution, where there is a particular trait, behavior. It doesn't have to be behavior. It could also be some other more physiological trait, something like risk of certain diseases, that may actually have evolved in conditions where there was some benefit that came from that. Maybe there still is some benefit that came from that, but there's also a cost in other conditions or in other environments or at other times.
It's an interesting one because I suppose in many ways, and I think the study and the later conversation around it hinted that whilst ADHD is good for when you have rivals, it's less good for when you have to kind of attenuate berry collecting to seasons like our ancestors would have done. So again, there is still a trade-off there that you'll be better against people of your own species, but you might not be able to keep time so well when you need to know the seasons well enough to collect berries sort of naturally.
Yeah, and that's going to be true. I mean, that's going to be true of any adaptive trait, to be honest. It's always going to be a relative thing. Are you doing better in this condition, in this environment, than the people with the other version or with some other kind of behavior? And if so, then you'll have the advantage, but there might come a time where that's no longer the case, or might come conditions where it's not the case, and then you're at a disadvantage. One of the problems with trying to decide whether or not something has evolved like this is it's actually, people have found ever since Darwin that it's actually quite easy to come up with plausible arguments for why something was of benefit. The problem is that because it's quite easy to come up with these stories, that they sometimes are given the term just so stories because we're not sure if they're true or not. So how do you establish that actually this really was the cause, that there really was an evolutionary advantage that came from this, rather than it just being some side effect or consequence of something else happening in evolution?
Not to put you on the spot here, but is there any answer to that?
There is some independent evidence, and that comes from genetics, from the genome. You can go and look. If you have some idea about what genetic factors are associated with this trait, so in the case of ADHD, we know that there are some genes, versions of some genes that are make you more likely to have ADHD, and therefore it has, there is some heritable component. Not that they're entirely causal, there are lots of other factors involved, environmental factors. But if you know that there are genetic factors, you can go and look at those gene variants and see, when did they arise? Can you date the time when those variants appeared or when they rose in frequency? And we can do that now because we have all of these genomes from people all around the world, and we've got ancient DNA, so we can actually go and look, in many cases, at genomes in the past, and we can see, did they have this particular gene risk allele? Was it present at one point in time or at low frequency and then high frequency later? And people have done that, I believe, with ADHD, and I think they find that it's not so clear. In fact, these versions of these variants have been around for quite a long time. Neanderthals, for example, have the genes that we associate with ADHD. So it's actually something that maybe have been with us for a very long time in our evolution. It's not so clear that it evolved recently in response to changes in human population sizes or subsistence strategies or something like this. So the story, I think, is still a little bit confused as to whether or not this explanation really holds.
And Shivani, from medical side of things, because it's always been touted to me that ADHD is detrimental and it requires behavioral therapy or medication, regardless of whether or not it's an evolutionary advantage or not. Does this kind of almost skew the way we look at it, and perhaps there should be a more societal or medical shift in the ways that we look and treat this?
Absolutely. And I think not just for ADHD, but things like autism. It's interesting that the term disorder or disease are being used to classify these things, because I guess if you look at how society's changed, before it was better to be, stronger or faster when we had to hunt for our food, things that benefited that were selected for. And now society's moved to emphasis placed on things like intelligence or focus or, academia. So how can you say traits that benefit, certain jobs or how humans were tens of thousands of years ago and now a disorder? It's just sort of coming back to the fact that humans are different. Every human is different to the other human, and everything lies on a spectrum, and certain people are better at things than others. And in the case of autism, I mean, there have been studies showing that people with autism should really be really valued members of society. I mean, they can be proficient musicians or painters or have, really great focus and attention to detail, and probably will outperform someone who doesn't have autism on a variety of tasks and jobs. And likewise, for ADHD, it's definitely a condition that negatively affects a lot of children, and increasingly there are parents who are worried that their child isn't able to focus at school, and that's why I suppose medical professionals are quite quick to jump to things like medication or therapy, because they might feel that in comparison they need that to kind of stay on average. So I think the terminology disorder is wrong, and there shouldn't really be so much stigma in terms of having this diagnosis, and we should shift to how can we support these people better, or how can we align them to career paths that they're better suited to, because not everyone is good at the same thing, and that's what makes society function, I think.
Thank you very much, as usual, to Shivani Shukla and Aylwyn Scally. And in just a moment, we're about to break some ground on Naked Genetics.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
You're listening to Naked Genetics, the show that looks at genes and the geniuses that study them. And hey, here's an idea. Let's actually talk about some actual boots-on-the-ground, honest-to-God genetic sequencing now. I mean, it's been part of the introduction to the show for long enough. This stuff is pretty close to witchcraft by now. By taking a tiny sample of some organic material, you can then identify the chemical building blocks, adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil if you're feeling feisty, but also the order in which they are ordered. From that, you can work out the organism and the parts of the organism that the sample came from. I mean, the applications seem endless. And thanks to my new best friends at biotechnology company Illumina, over the next few months, we are going to delve into just what the cutting edge of sequencing technology can reveal about our world. I knew that line sounded familiar. Anyway, let's begin with a story. Like I said, the applications of genetic sequencing are absurdly wide-reaching, and so if I asked you where do you think genetic sequencing is currently playing a huge part in shaping our future, where would your mind go? Disease identification? Absolutely. Forensics? 100%. But how many of you thought of here? Mining. Actually, this mine is a bit noisy. Can we go next door? That's better. Mining, particularly coal mining, is a controversial subject and has a reputation for contributing to global climate change. That is irrefutable. However, for us to venture into a clean new world of renewable energies, we will need coal.
We need coal to make steel. A single wind turbine requires nearly 5 tons of copper and over 300 tons of steel. And to make that steel, you need coal.
That's Illumina's Dan Letchworth, by the way. He's going to be talking us through quite a lot of this. So, if we must continue to mine for coal, for the moment at least, we must also contend with the other stuff that appears when you dig a big hole in the ground.
So one of the harmful byproducts of mining is selenium. Selenium is a naturally occurring element, but the problem is that mining tends to grind and chew up the rock and expose a whole lot more selenium to the surface than would naturally be uncovered. And because the mining process breaks up the rock into tiny pieces, suddenly the surface area is vastly multiplied. And those are usually just exposed to the atmosphere, exposed to the air and water. And so precipitation from rain and snow runoff that can carry these leftover bits of selenium into the water supply, into rivers and streams.
By the way, if you weren't sure, that's bad.
Selenium is a required element for cell function in animals. All animals, humans included, use selenium as a natural part of their metabolism. But just like the phrase goes, the dose makes the poison. High enough concentrations of selenium can cause growth defects in fish, and it can adversely affect their population numbers. And unfortunately, if selenium levels get too high in the water supply, communities that rely on that water to drink can also have negative health effects as well.
So what to do then with this excess buildup?
The companies I spoke with, Tech Resources and Rio Tinto, Tech in particular has implemented selenium-eating bacteria. What Tech does is they introduce this bacteria to the waste rock piles with a small amount of the carbon-based food that the bacteria eat. And as a part of their metabolism, these bacteria take the dissolved selenium and convert it into a harder, more solid form, selenite crystal, which is then heavier and it's easier for humans to keep out of the water supply.
A species of bacteria is capable of treating metals like selenium. That's pretty amazing, but perhaps not all that surprising, as the University of British Columbia's John Steen explains.
Microbes have been around metals for a long time. They're evolved to interact with metals, and some quite specifically. They use metals for metabolism. They use metals for their energy systems. The reason why we have deposits of iron ore around the world is because of microbes and what they were doing billions of years ago.
And so that begs the question, what else is out there? If there really are, as some have estimated, 1 trillion species of microbes undiscovered beneath our feet, what might they be capable of? Well, that's where Illumina and the Mining Microbiome Analytics Platform, or MMAP to its friends, comes in. A plan to find out if anything underground can help us out on the surface. Here's Alonia's Elizabeth Diet to explain that a bit better.
I think that microbes offer an untapped potential in a lot of different areas. And what MMAP is really trying to do is understand that potential at a much deeper level than we've ever been able to have before. And a lot of times our capabilities are limited by what our own samples can tell us. But what MMAP is doing is sort of allowing the collective community and all of the samples that come in from various sources to help enhance an individual's project while still having data security parameters on it.
Yes, exactly. And naturally, genetic sequencing has a huge role to play in this. Illumina's Dan Letchworth again.
So it all starts with the target is 15,000 samples of soil and rock from different mine sites. And what Illumina does is extract the DNA present in those soil samples and sequence it. And then through the secondary analysis software, you can piece together the original sequence of all the life forms present in that soil. From what we've heard so far in the project, about 80% of the life forms they found have been previously unknown, undescribed species of bacteria.
So that is a lot of new potentially helpful microbes already. And if you can sequence new microbes, you can find out what they do and, perhaps more importantly, share that knowledge with the group. So says Kunki Cloud Services' Aria Hahn.
We've developed statistical software that will find novel genes of a known function. And so you might be interested in methane production, for example. And so we're able to find new genes that are previously, we didn't know that that's what they were doing, and say, like, we're pretty sure that this is doing methane production, as an example. As we find those novel genes as well, we're again able to put that back into mmap so that if you're to try to see what is happening in my samples, you can benefit from all of that prior knowledge.
And this shared knowledge is already bearing fruit.
About 20% of the copper being mined in the world is being mined through hydrometallurgy, which uses either strong acids or, more frequently these days, bacteria to leach the copper from the source rock, which is, as you can imagine, a much more environmentally friendly way to do it. Bacteria can bind the fine sand particles that would otherwise get tossed up into the air and create a potentially hazardous breathing situation for mining workers. They can use bacteria to help with dust suppression.
But what if you found a useful detoxifying gene, but in a bacteria that is, on the whole, still harmful to humans? That might not be a problem either.
If the scientists analyzing the data from mmap discover a potentially useful gene that could, for example, clean a toxic compound that is found in mine soil, but it's in a bacteria that would be harmful to humans, genetic engineering scientists could transport that gene into a different bacteria and then encourage that bacteria to reproduce with that gene. So you have a new kind of bacteria that performs that toxin cleaning function without being harmful to humans.
So this is a rapidly developing field, but one that has already shown immense promise. And isn't it so enticing to think that a key to clean energy development could already be there, just beneath our feet? Or, as Kunki's Aria Hahn puts it,
it's really easy to focus on the world that we can see. And we all do this in our day-to-day lives because we have to, and it's practical and it makes sense. But the more that I learned about microbes, the more that I learned, like, this is their planet and they are actually responsible for its maintenance and health. They were here long before we were, and they will be here long after us. And so to understand them is to understand in a lot of ways what has given life to us and our planet and everything that we do see. And so there's something I think just existentially beautiful about that concept.
Thank you to Kunki's Aria Hahn, Alonia's Elizabeth Dayette, and University of British Columbia's John Steen. And a huge thank you to Dan Letchworth and the rest of Illumina for showing me this hidden world. Mine's a pint. And to round off this episode of Naked Genetics, it's time for Quirks of Evolution. And let me whisk you away to the tropical rainforests of Western Indonesia. Look at this place. Beautiful, isn't it? Let's have a look round. Do you know there's an estimated 300,000 species of animal in Indonesia? That's more than 4 times as many as in the UK. And all of that life and all of those natural processes will inevitably lead to a lot of, waste. So do keep your eye out for any excrement that might be around. No, I'm serious. You need to keep your eye out. Otherwise, today's specimen has probably just bamboozled you. Let us examine the curious case of Wallace's flying frog. The adult tree frogs are a delightful green and white with big beady yellow eyes, and any normal program trying to extol the virtues of this frog would absolutely focus on the adaptation in the animal's name. Wallace's flying frogs have such large feet and with so much webbing in between their toes that they can move from tree to tree by gliding, sometimes distances of over 50 feet, and that's pretty magical. But Attenborough already covered flying tree frogs, so let's talk about something else. Whilst the adults are a feast for the eyes, they are crucially green. That's good news if you have many predators and live in a rainforest. However, the juvenile frogs, once they've developed from being tadpoles, are red. That seems like a pretty bad idea in a green-rich environment. But they aren't just red. They're red with brown and white speckles on them. And if you've ever returned to your car and found that a bird has left its business on your pride and joy, perhaps you can see where this is going. This remarkable amphibian has evolved a unique and ingenious camouflage strategy. It is the first vertebrate that we know of that evolves to resemble fecal matter. Welcome back, by the way, to everyone that quickly went off to have a look at one. And I'm sure you all agree, it's pretty convincing. The mottled shades of brown and red, the coloration is not uniform but rather varies in texture and tone, mimicking the irregularities and inconsistencies found in... Additionally, the frogs often adopt a posture that enhances their resemblance to a lump of waste by remaining motionless for long periods of time. It was clearly convincing enough for scientists at the University of Vienna to put them to task. At the Schönbrunn Zoo, wax replicates of frogs were placed into aviaries containing predatory birds. Some wax frogs were green, some completely red, and some had speckles like our dear old flying frogs. And whilst the red replicas were attacked significantly more than the green ones, that rate dropped by half when the red frogs had a fecal flourish added to them. All these predatory birds have colour vision, by the way, so they did account for that too. So the paper postulates, or maybe it postulates, no, it definitely doesn't. The paper postulates that, unsurprisingly, predators do not want to eat something that looks like poo. And whilst it's a pretty gross theory, it's not without precedent. There are a few other species, like the swallowtail butterfly caterpillar and the bird-dropping spider, no, really, that really do make for excellent excrement. Biologically, a lot of species, ourselves included, are obviously hardwired to be repulsed by poo. And sure, it carries disease or organisms that carry disease. Definitely something worth having, but at the same time, means there are very few species in the rainforest that want to drop by some droppings on the off chance that it's a frog. It's simply not worth the risk, and I think that's fair enough. Anyway, sorry for dumping that on you unexpectedly. That's it for this episode of Naked Genetics, but do join us next time for more Genetscapades. If you'd like to get in touch in the meantime, drop me a line at willt@nakedscientists.com. Until next time, take care and goodbye.